Good afternoon and welcome to our discussion of Dr. Kathryn Brackney's book, Surreal Geographies, A New History of Holocaust Consciousness, which I have right here, published in 2024 with University of Wisconsin Press. And I could add, it is also George L. Mosse First Book Prize winner. My name is Professor Chad Gibbs. I'm director of the Zucker Goldberg Center for Holocaust Studies at the College of Charleston, and I'm just going to chair today's event, move us through things. Please be aware that the event is being recorded. I have a couple of few acknowledgments and then introductions to make, and then some technical details to share before I pass over to Kate. First, I'd like to acknowledge the staff and supporters of the organizations underwriting today's event. This new book event is made possible by the History Department, the Mosse Weinstein Center for Jewish Studies, and the Center for European Studies, as well as the George L. Mosse Program in History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, as well as by the Zucker Goldberg Center for Holocaust Studies here at the College of Charleston. We thank them all for bringing us together today. Kathryn's discussion of her book will be followed today by comments from Professor Shir Ganor at the University of Minnesota. Shir Ganor is Assistant Professor of History at University of Minnesota Twin Cities. Her research and teaching interests include German Jewish history, the Holocaust, forced migration, memory of mass violence, and modern German history. She's currently finalizing her first monograph, which traces the emergence of a transnational diasporic community of refugees who's fled Nazi violence. We need to talk. I'm working on a second project like that myself. So, Dr. Kathryn Brackney is Assistant Professor of History at Leiden University in the Netherlands. Her current research explores how aesthetic norms have developed for remembering the Holocaust and other crimes against humanity. She teaches courses in modern European intellectual and cultural history. Before coming to Leiden, she taught at the Posen Center for Human Rights at the University of Chicago and Harvard College's History and Literature program. She holds a PhD from Yale. Today, Kate will provide a discussion of her book, followed by comments from Shir, and then a Q&A from the audience, and I'll facilitate that. You can go ahead and drop your questions into the Q&A at any time, and we will read them out for you at the end. So without further delay, I pass over to Kate, and thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Chad, for hosting this event. And thank you so much to the Mosse program for supporting and publishing the book. So the talk will be about 45 minutes. And then, Shir, I really look forward to your questions. Okay. In the mid-1950s, when the Yiddish poet Abraham Sutzkever looked back on his experiences during the Nazi occupation of Vilna, the color palette of his memory was green. In his series of symbolist prose poems, Green Aquarium, the poetic narrator wonders if it might be possible for him to see those he lost in Vilna once again. What follows is a vision. Quote, "A green knife slit open the earth. It became green, the green of a half moon, seen with green eyes from under a wave, and the joyous green of grass bordering a grave. Greens flow into greens, body into body, and the earth stands transformed into a green aquarium. Closer, come closer to the green whirlpool. I look in. People swim here like fishes, countless phosphorus faces." Sutzkever's early life was marked by historic calamities that destroyed his Jewish community, including exile to Siberia during World War I and finally the Holocaust. To memorialize these events, Benjamin Harshaw explains that Sutzkever, quote, "resorted to a poetic pantheon for the dead, a denial of realism as a way to assert the subsistence of an annihilated world in some cosmic space." Sutzkever was perhaps the most talented Yiddish writer of the 20th century. However, the most famous Yiddish speaker to write about the Holocaust remains Elie Wiesel, whose memoir Die Welt hat geschwiegen was published in French in edited form as La Nuit, or Night. Formulating cosmic visions that deny realism was not the project of what are now the most widely circulated memoirs and diaries to memorialize the Holocaust. By the late 1950s, literary works that today constitute a transnational canon, including Wiesel's Night, Primo Levi's If This Is a Man, and Anna Frank's diary, were already in wide circulation. These memoirs and documents in the realist mode have become such fundamental tools for remembering the Holocaust that when I teach the prose poem Green Aquarium with its phosphorus faces and its honeybee with a human soul who comes from Vilna to sting the poet's heart, or when I show this much later image, which is a self-portrait donated to Yad Vashem by Holocaust survivor Elsa Susanna Langer, my students are often taken aback. Is this what Holocaust memory is supposed to look like and sound like? Langer's uncanny painting, which regards us with asymmetrical eyes through a watery scrim, seems more redolent of the expressionist movement associated with the lead up to World War I and its aftermath, not the Holocaust. These sources seem to break some set of rules that my students have internalized, and these rules apply not just to literature or art. When you enter a major national center of Holocaust remembrance, you're likely to encounter some central common elements. Visitors may view video portraits of survivors telling their stories, or encounter an austere, visually minimalist memorial like the Wall of Names at the Memorial de la Shoah, or postmodern works of fragmentary art that meditate on the limits of representing trauma. Indeed, though the national significations of the Holocaust vary significantly among memorial museums in DC, Jerusalem, Paris, and Berlin, there's a common aesthetic idiom that links these spaces together, characterized by abstract minimalism, realism, and postmodern fragmentation. My book asks, how did this transnational cultural consensus on the aesthetic conventions of memory emerge? And how was the Holocaust imagined before these conventions became predominant? What my book argues is that Sutzkever's Green Aquarium or Langer's uncanny image of herself as a survivor are not outliers. This book identifies an eclectic, surreal tradition of Holocaust remembrance that was common before the 1980s and that still has a largely unacknowledged effect on how the genocide of Europe's Jewish populations has been linked analogically to other forms of trauma and catastrophe. The book shows how portrayals of Jewish victims and survivors have shifted over time from a sometimes alien and otherworldly planet Auschwitz in the high phases of the Cold War to the intimate and domestic spaces of testimonial interviews. In so doing, the book denaturalizes a central tenet of Holocaust aesthetics and memorialization, namely that this event uniquely defies representation. Each chapter is organized around different spaces or imaginative geographies where Holocaust memory has been staged. The first chapter of the book, which focuses on 1944 to the early 60s, reveals how Jewish refugee artists and writers scattered across the globe, such as Sutzkever, Chagall, Celan, and Anna Longfuss, turned to surreal visual vocabularies and hallucinatory imagery to memorialize their destroyed communities and make sense of their indeterminate position in the post-war world. The poems, novels, paintings featured in that chapter are linked by inventive hybrid images of the dead who persist in interim spaces of afterlife between water and sky. These images can often convey an enduring intimacy between survivors and those who they lost, and also, conversely, alienation from the living. Although the artists I focus on are clearly indebted to or were a part of the interwar avant-garde, the function of surreal imagery in their work differs from the earlier pioneering work of surrealists like André Breton, who believed that releasing the power of the psychic unconscious could remake European politics. After the Holocaust, the artists I focus on used dreamlike imagery and associations, not so much to construct the future, but to seek passage through the collapsed horizons of the past. The second chapter of the book examines the figure of Planet Auschwitz as it emerged in both popular and high culture during the Cold War, as international Holocaust consciousness was beginning to reemerge. The sources in that chapter reveal how tensions over the Holocaust's universal relevance and particularity as a Jewish event were understood under the pressure of a new international spotlight in the 1960s. The later chapters, and you have in this slide kind of representative image from each chapter. The later chapters examine a period from the late 70s to the early 2000s, when popular depictions of the Holocaust increased significantly, even as artists and literary theorists placed this past beyond the limits of representation. I show how mass media events and documentary art grounded the Holocaust in individual portraiture, sometimes at sites where genocide actually occurred. Chapter 3 looks at the emergence of video testimony by survivors, which became a hegemonic form of remembrance for the Holocaust. If surrealism was the most significant aesthetic movement to respond to Freudian geographies of the subconscious in the wake of World War I, filmed and video portraits of the Holocaust testimony can be understood as another later genre that attempted to respond in both form and content to the mind fractured by trauma. By highlighting key settings where victims and survivors have been portrayed over time, that is, the alien world of planet Auschwitz, the intimacy of home and video testimony, and the theme of the crime itself, and later documentaries like Landsman Shoah, the project considers how a variety of imaginative spaces give shape to memory, irreducible to national boundaries. Ultimately, the book reveals the slow cultural processes by which Jewish victims of genocide have been enframed as fully human, grievable lives, both in and beyond survivor communities. The fulcrum of the book is between chapters 2 and 3, which tracks the transition from planet Auschwitz as an otherworldly terrain of memory to the era of testimony in the 1970s through the early 90s, which created a domesticated and more intimate frame of remembrance. So I'm going to focus the rest of the talk mostly on those two chapters. Chapter 2 starts in the summer of 1961 when Auschwitz survivor and author Yehiel Ganor took the witness stand at the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. When asked why he chose to publish under the famous pen name Katzetnik, the witness presented himself as a kind of mystic anthropologist back from a world he called the Auschwitz planet, with its own inhabitants and natural laws. The name, he explained, is not a pen name. Quote, I myself was at the Auschwitz camp for 2 years. The time there is not a concept as it is here on our planet. Every fraction of a second has a different wheel of time, and the inhabitants of that planet had no names. They had no parents, and they had no children. They were not clothed as we are clothed here. They were not born there, and they did not conceive there. They breathed and lived according to different laws of nature. They did not live according to the laws of this world of ours, and they did not die. Their name was a number, Katzetnik, number so-and-so. And I believe wholeheartedly that just as in astrology, the stars influence our destiny, so is this planet of ashes, Auschwitz, radiating towards our planet. Close quote. Ganor's agitation and tendency to speak in a highly symbolic register made his story untellable within the confines of the courtroom. After the judges urged him to focus on the Attorney General's questions, Ganor lost consciousness and had to be carried from the witness stand. To many spectators in the court, his collapse was a devastating shock. Ultimately, it would become the most remembered moment of the trial. Because Ganor's silence seems the most fitting testimony to the nightmare he tried to describe, it's tempting to gloss over the words he was able to say as a mere prelude. Today, the vulnerable and all too human witness who fails to convey a trauma that still haunts him seems the more appropriate figure of memory than the alien Auschwitz planet that radiates towards Earth on a different wheel of time. The mix of symbolic systems that the author referenced to make meaning of the past and comment on the destiny of humankind may come off to contemporary readers as confused and perhaps even offensive. Yet Ganor was not the only public figure to draw on such imagery to describe Jewish persecution in the broader univers concentrationnaire. Omer Bartov has argued that in the early decades after the Holocaust, this language of otherworldliness spoke to the deep ambivalence that many Israelis felt about the compatibility of Jewish victimization with nationalist identity. Outside of Israel, as the Holocaust became differentiated from other crimes of fascism in the wake of international coverage of the Eichmann trial, artists and authors in Western Europe and North America also frequently figured Auschwitz as an alien world at the limits of modernity. Implicit in the sources the book presents from that period are questions not just about the inclusion of survivors in the nation, but also about how to restore anyone touched by the Holocaust into the category of the human. Through the 60s and 70s, authors and artists from Primo Levi to Steven Spielberg evoked the memory of the Holocaust together with meditations on life beyond Earth, using the figure of Planet Auschwitz to reimagine the status of humanity in the shadow of an other somewhere out there. With strange frequency during this stretch of the Cold War, Jewish identity, racial violence, and the penetration of the cosmos were thought together in sources that cannot all be dismissed as kitsch. Most of the materials from that chapter in my book have not endured in canons of Holocaust art and literature that we've inherited today. And this is partly because the figure of Planet Auschwitz reflects a set of cultural intuitions that are anathema to many of us now. In 1978, the release of NBC's miniseries Holocaust in the US and later Western Europe renewed public attention to the experience of victims and provoked debates about representing the past. In 1979, what would become Yale's Fortunoff Archive gave survivors themselves a new format for narrating their own stories, which was video testimony. And later, in his extraordinary documentary art film, Shoah, Claude Lanzmann also relied on personal interviews, overlaying the oral testimony of survivors, bystanders, and perpetrators onto contemporary shots of empty extermination sites. Lanzmann's pairing of the graphic word with the barren image became highly influential in broader debates about appropriate aesthetic approaches to the Holocaust. Authors and critics from Adorno to Elie Wiesel had long characterized the Holocaust as presenting fundamental problems to literature, but in the 80s and 90s, the limits of representation as such were a major preoccupation for the French and American academies. Even as depictions of the Holocaust increased, the conventions of its representation narrowed and became highly articulated. And I discuss this at length in chapter 4. But before the Holocaust became an unimaginable trauma recounted by witnesses in quiet interviews at their homes or at the scene of the crime, my book shows that these memories were staged elsewhere. I analyze a wider range of representational strategies and associative matrices that, for better or worse, also shaped how the Holocaust was remembered before the conventions that we're familiar with now became pervasive. In the early years of international Holocaust consciousness, Jews who survived Auschwitz often appeared to be from a different world, imagined as figures of identification somewhere between human and other, inhabiting a region that seemed both a distant and inevitable destination in the evolution of mankind. So why would a survivor like Ganor try to convey the radical difference of his experiences at Auschwitz by projecting the camp onto a newly permeable galaxy? And conversely, how did the Holocaust's reemerging visual iconography in the 60s and 1970s affect representations of what life might look like in future worlds? To answer these questions, we must remember 1961 as a year when the Eichmann trial and the space race vied for headlines on the pages of the world's newspapers. On April 11th, Eichmann appeared in the first courtroom trial to be broadcast internationally. And just one day later, on April 12th, Yuri Gagarin became the first human being to orbit the Earth, marking a new phase in the American and Soviet proxy war taking place beyond the atmosphere. Consider the front page of the New York Times from April 12th. Soviet orbits man and recovers him. Space pioneer sent messages while circling Earth. Meanwhile, almost bulletproof glass booth hovering above spectators at his trial. Eichmann's involvement in crimes against humanity on a massive scale and Gagarin's spaceflight were testaments to the astonishing and horrifying capabilities of modern civilization. Across the Atlantic in Le Monde, the French newspaper Le Monde, stories about the war in Algeria, Gagarin's launch, and the Eichmann trial revolved around each other on the first 10 pages of the paper. In his cultural history of the Apollo missions, Matthew Triba has demonstrated that the space race, the atom bomb, Nazism, and eventually the war in Vietnam formed a major constellation of transatlantic thought during the 1960s and 70s, with many authors and journalists thinking the spectacular achievements of rocket science against the backdrop of the 20th century's unprecedented violence. Would the great beyond provide a release for alienated families of men who seemed incapable of encountering each other as human? Or would the untethering of human beings from Earth and the power of scientific extraction culminate in man's ultimate alienation from himself? In 1966, Primo Levi took up these themes in Natural Stories, a collection of science fiction written under a pen name on topics ranging from lunar travel, the medical formulation of human-animal hybrids, and the recreation of humans by a bureaucratic committee, with references to the Holocaust throughout. In his next collection of science fiction, Levi broadened his allegorical focus to American race relations. In one story, The Hard Sellers, Levi imagines the process by which souls are installed into human bodies. Sales representatives for the planet Earth pitch the option of human life to an unborn soul. The soul agrees to go to Earth, but with one qualification. Quote, I prefer to be born Black, Indian, poor, without indulgences. You understand me, don't you? I prefer the anger that I will need. The path of defenseless and blind humanity will be mine. In that story by Primo Levi, the unborn soul, contemplating Earth from above, embarks upon this project with a sense of profound moral orientation on the question of race, derived implicitly from his own experiences in a recent lifetime. In a related vein, Isaac Bashevis Singer's story, Cafeteria, translated from Yiddish for the New Yorker in 1968, also provides a comment on American racial divides from the perspective of a Holocaust survivor who breaks through the space-time continuum. But the past, in this case, is a source not of moral clarity, but chronic disorientation. While Levi's unborn soul resolves to live, Bashevis's narrator isn't sure whether the Jewish refugees who surround him in New York are alive or dead. Questioning his own sanity, he experiences the city as a post-apocalyptic dreamscape filled with inexplicable phenomena, such as Hitler's appearance at meetings of the KKK on the Upper West Side. New York is the off-kilter center of a world long ago destroyed, filled with ghosts set adrift in the cosmos. These stories and many other sources in the book organize Holocaust memory around allegories of otherworldliness using a language of science and surreality. But how much reach did they really have? You might be asking yourself. Were people really reading Levi's short fiction, which wasn't even published under his name, more than, for instance, If This Is a Man? And that's a fair question. I do think the impact of Planet Auschwitz as a figure of remembrance, though, becomes apparent in one of the most widely seen films of the 1970s, a film which most of us wouldn't recognize as about the Holocaust at all. And that's Close Encounters of the Third Kind. By the mid-70s, we can see in this blockbuster an unconscious and totally integrated iconography of space travel, humanoid encounter, and concentrationary landscapes, images that Spielberg would revisit throughout his film career. The film is the most famous popular visualization of the gray alien, which first entered science fiction in the early works of H.G. Wells. This naked, mute, and sexless humanoid with a large head and eyes and small body starred in the most famous American abduction account from the mid-century, and that was the case of Betty and Barney Hill, an interracial couple who claimed to have been subjected to alien experiments in 1961. In Spielberg's film, the gray alien and the Jewish Musulman merge into a single figure, an environment shaped by numerous visual rhymes with iconographic images from Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen. In the film's climactic final scenes, Midwestern father Roy Neary encounters a group of small, silent, naked, androgynous beings on a top-secret government site protected by barbed wire, surrounded by the dead bodies of animals reportedly exposed to deadly gas. The outlying area has been forcibly evacuated by government officials. We see civilian crowds at a train station where screaming families are shoved into train cars by gruff military officials. At the film's conclusion, a massive ship releases back to Earth a group of men and women who disappeared during the war. What we see in these final scenes is a terrifying, sublime, and ultimately corrected or redeemed encounter with a benign other from the wartime past, set against the backdrop of galactic exploration. The madness of those who claim to have seen visions from another world is revealed to be insight into the truth. The aliens communicate through sign language and song, inviting Miri, sunburned red by their ship's lights, the film suggests like an Indian, to venture back into their world. Scholar Susan Lepselter explores the links between alien abduction stories from the American Southwest and early American captivity narratives about white settlers kidnapped by Native peoples. She argues that, quote, the fallout of the still open wound of Native American colonization and genocide has drifted into 20th century stories about aliens from space. This constellation of tropes has also appeared in a novel more specific to memory of the Holocaust in Mr. Samler's Planet, first published in 1969. Saul Bellow imagined viewing American social disintegration from the vantage point of the moon through the privileged perspective of a Holocaust survivor. Like Close Encounters, Bellow's novel thematizes the possibility of communicating across difference. The culminating scene is a conversation between an aerospace engineer from India and the novel's protagonist, a Polish Jewish survivor who lectures on the works of H.G. Wells and laments the state of civilization from a dilapidated corner of the Upper West Side. Both witnessed genocide in the 1940s, but hold out hope that if Americans can colonize the moon, as they did the continent, the New World might provide some relief from the political turmoil below. Against Bellow's fiction and Lepselter's analysis, the gas masks, barbed wire, alien ships, and latent references to genocide that flash together in Spielberg's film with scenes from India and the American West take on a strange cultural coherence that might otherwise elude us today. Close Encounters premiered in 1977. The following year, the NBC miniseries Holocaust was broadcast in the US. And in 1979, the Fortunoff Archive was founded, which ushered in a different chapter of Holocaust memory. Since the late 1970s, we've entered an era of testimony. Intimate portrayals of victims and their families and interviews with survivors themselves have brought this past down to earth, so to speak. While trauma studies has given us much to understand about the fragmentation of the self in the wake of violence, the human status of victims is no longer an implicit question. The victim of the Holocaust has ultimately become a figure of moral consensus, commemorated with a shared transnational set of secular mourning rites. Chapter 3 of the book tracks this shift, focusing particularly on the work of psychoanalyst Dory Laub, who co-founded the Fortunoff, which first popularized the video testimony format. While many scholars would come to celebrate video testimony for its simple, disciplined framing techniques and direct manner of storytelling, I argue that at least in its early days, these early interviews still retained some of the surreal components of an earlier, more eclectic tradition of remembrance characterized by Planet Auschwitz. Hannah Polen-Gallay has argued that ever since the pioneering work of David Boder, who made audio recordings of Jewish survivors in DP camps in 1948, giving testimony has been coupled with the goals of psychotherapy, a field that approaches narration as a tool for healing. In the early post-war period, American psychological approaches to trauma, coupled with popular fiction and memoir, approached the destruction of European Jews through, quote, individual self-disclosure, memory recovery, and intimate relationships. While the alienated victim on Planet Auschwitz emerged in the intervening years as a competing memorial framework, by the late 70s, video testimony started to import the more personal focus that Polen-Gallay describes into a mass collective visual medium. While Boder recorded interviews with 109 survivors, the newer video archives that developed from the 70s onward ultimately produced tens of thousands of sources in thoroughly cataloged archives that are now digitally accessible. As survivors negotiated with deep-seated feelings of alienation through a growing number of public platforms, the testimonial self-portraits that they created over the next 20 years were reflected in popular films, documentary art, and later museum exhibitions, which portrayed survivors through ever more intimate visual frames. One early pioneering work of filmed testimony was by the post-expressionist painter and Auschwitz survivor Marian S. Marian. In the early 70s, Marian found himself confronting his childhood traumatic memories under a doctor's care. In 1975, with fellow artist Kenny Schneider, he produced an experimental film at his studio in the Chelsea Hotel in New York, where he finally narrated his experiences during the Holocaust. This was shortly after Claude Lanzmann became shooting what would become his own testimonial masterpiece, Shoah, which was released in 1985. But back in 1975, we can see that the aesthetic of Marian's film, titled Ecce Homo, is almost diametrically opposed to Lanzmann's austere realism, empty landscapes, and haunted silence. Marian's film is both a meditation on the nature of man and a stark representation of the artist's specific experience of genocidal persecution as a Jew. It opens with the haunting vocals of cantor Pierre Penchik, which play over a montage of images including the My Lai massacre, hooded members of the KKK, a moon rocket taking off into space, and bodies piled up at Nazi concentration camps. Images of corpses dissolve into a collage of powerful and grotesque paintings at Marian's studio. The artist intersperses these confrontational stills with footage of himself, sometimes wrapped in a straitjacket marked with the Star of David, as he begins to tell his own traumatic story of the Nazi massacre at Rzeszów. After he miraculously survived a bullet through the neck, Marian explains, quote, "Just for the kick of it, they let me live. Just as last night they shot everybody for kicks. Now I can smell the powder of the gun." This sense memory appears to trigger Marian. Quote, "Everybody says I'm not guilty. I didn't do anything wrong, but it doesn't help me." Pausing with palpable anguish, he closes his eyes and moans to Schneider behind the camera, "Let's stop for a while." For a moment, the audio cuts, then Marian's testimony resumes. While he resisted the label of Holocaust artist, in this film, he stages an extraordinary and deeply painful confrontation with the past, explicitly linking his artistic iconography to the genocide of Europe's Jews, the anti-war movement, racism in America, and the nature of man. Bringing together so many of the images from the earlier visual vocabulary of Planet Auschwitz into a personal testimonial film, Ecce Homo is a transitional document that uses the gamut of representational techniques at Marian's disposal to portray his own psychic torment as a reverberation of ongoing world historical crimes. In 1979, 4 years after Marian made his film at the Chelsea Hotel, psychoanalyst Dory Laub founded the Fortunoff just a few stops up the commuter line in New Haven. Originally from Chernowitz, Laub survived the Obodovka ghetto in Transnistria during the Holocaust. After immigrating to Israel, he trained in medicine and eventually went on to study psychiatry at Harvard. In the same year that he founded what would become the Fortunoff Archive, 1979, Laub imagined the systematic scholarly study of interviews with survivors in an article that he published in the journal Patterns of Prejudice for a special issue which covered the problem of resurgent Holocaust denialism among the ultra-right wing in the 1970s. During this moment, denialism motivated the development of memory culture around the Holocaust, certified by firsthand witnesses who battled resurgent anti-Semitism with new forms of storytelling, shaped particularly by increasing attention to trauma in the field of psychology. All of these trends are evident in Laub's career as a psychoanalyst and archivist. Against that backdrop of resurgent Holocaust denialism in the 1970s, it's striking that Laub's article in Patterns of Prejudice doesn't hesitate to describe the traumatized survivor's psyche in that article as kind of shipwrecked between fantasy and reality. He argues that the small number of Jewish survivors from the Nazi camp system emerged from, quote, a sadomasochistic and psychotic world, which in some cases profoundly undermined their ability to, quote, perform the task of reality testing. To illustrate, Laub cites Jerzy Kosinski's novel, The Painted Bird, as, quote, a most powerful narrative that blurs fact and fiction in the experiences of his hero. Laub's only reference to literature on the Holocaust in this article was not one of the canonical memoirs, but Kosinski's grotesque collection of folk tales, which follow an orphan through the enchanted hellscape of Poland's hinterlands during the Holocaust. The Painted Bird, first published in 1965, prompted nationalist critics in Poland to denounce Kosinski for fabricating a bestial caricature of the peasantry. 10 years later, Kosinski addressed their allegations by insisting his book was not autobiographical. He framed his project instead as an imaginative projection back into childhood, quote, a slow unfreezing of the mind wherein backgrounds emerge from the shadows. Kosinski's insistence that the book should stand alone, apart from his biography, however, had not always been consistent. His editor at Houghton Mifflin commissioned The Painted Bird on the belief that it was nonfiction, and subsequent reviewers of the book, including Elie Wiesel, made the same assumption. In later years, information surfaced that Kosinski had lived disguised as a Gentile during the war with his immediate family, while his extended family was wiped out during the Holocaust. He was not an orphan, and there's little evidence to indicate that he wandered into the grotesque sexual atrocities described in The Painted Bird. Kosinski's very real need during childhood to hide his identity in a game of survival with the very highest stakes may have ultimately shaped his compulsive acts of self-construction for the rest of his life. In the wake of various scandals over the authenticity and even authorship of his works, he died by suicide in 1991. So in the slide here, you see the cover of the 1976 Bantam edition of Kosinski's book. The image they use for the cover is a detail from Hieronymus Bosch's painting, The Last Judgment, which depicts a demon in a bird-like plague mask carrying a weary traveler. And I just want to point out, this is a very different way to frame a survivor of the Holocaust than the image you see on the right from one of the first video testimonies at the Fortunoff of Leon W., filmed in 1979. Leon was a child survivor of the Łódź Ghetto who later immigrated to the US and opened a bakery in Connecticut. Yet, Laub's own founding image of the Fortunoff archive, in this founding image, Laub, as a psychoanalyst, saw similarities between these two apparently very different modes of narration, the painted bird and testimony. For a long time, historians avoided survivor testimony because they were suspicious of the impact of trauma on memory. For Laub, though, the overlap of memory, reality, fantasy, and nightmare was precisely the reason to engage with testimony. This complex mode of narration demanded scholarly attention. The earliest testimonies and network of interviewers at the Fortunoff grew out of the survivor community itself around New Haven. Training volunteers required formulating an institutional methodology. For Laub, the crucial component of the video testimony format was dialogue. Even though the interviewers are outside the camera's frame and try to minimize their interventions in the survivor's story, their presence allows the testimonial experience to be not just another recitation of the facts. At its best, Laub believed testimony enabled the survivor to establish the reality of a totally destabilizing experience by sharing that burden with a receptive listener. Quote, for the testimonial process to take place, Laub wrote, there needs to be a bonding, the intimate and total presence of another, in the position of one who hears. The initial interviews were held in the homes of survivors, which Laub explained, quote, attracted the neighbors in the kitchen. There was food served. People were coming in and out. And while that format might have helped to build interest in the project, Laub did not see it as ideal for the psychotherapeutic goals of testimony. Ultimately, the interview setting switched to a studio. Laub remembers, we wanted a neutral space where people could really wander into their fantasies. What became the signature ultra-minimalist look of the Fortunoff was chosen by Laub as a prime backdrop for delving into the taboo and subconscious. Before that transition into the black box studio, though, the first more informal testimonies filmed in Laub's office highlight the surreal contradiction at the heart of this mode of portraiture. That is the intersection of everyday life and intimate conversation with the unimaginable events that survivors so often describe. Against a warm backdrop of yellow curtains and an upholstered chair, Leon W. speaks of his happy childhood in Łódź, the start of the war, and finally, the horrific conditions in the ghetto. Hunger dehumanizes and breaks down family relations, he explains, with a confession that as a child, he stole bread from his own sister. Leon talks about seeing his large family disappear as disease, starvation, and deportation emptied the ghetto. Only occasionally do the interviewers, in this case Laub and Fortunoff co-founder Laurel Vlock, only occasionally do they interject with questions. On the third and final reel, as Leon describes his liberation, he admits that surviving did not bring him joy. Quote, I got something always in the back of my mind, which is like a double existence. I've lived probably a double life before and a life now, which is something entirely different. At the tape's conclusion, Block asks whether Leon has nightmares. Leon recalls experiencing nightmares while he lived in DP camps and suggests that the recording process now will make those nightmares return. Quote, I'll be dreaming tonight, I know that. Block comments on their imminent return from the frame of testimony to everyday reality. Well, Leon, you know, when I think of speaking to you in a normal way, to order a cake, I don't remember he's a baker. Leon interjects, that's the worst part. I live a very normal life. At that point, Leon's double existence seems to flash in the frame just before the tape cuts to black. Over time, the purpose of the Fortunoff shifted, and its project was replicated by Steven Spielberg's Shoah Foundation, created in Los Angeles after the release of Schindler's List. The Shoah Foundation has the resources to produce video portraits on a mass scale. And in their interviews, people give testimony in their living rooms and are encouraged to introduce family or include personal photos. The image produced of the survivor is very different than the image of the alienated or even inhuman victim common in earlier decades. I have a representative still up here of the poet Doña Klenman at the end of her interview being embraced by her husband. What's notable is in her oral testimony, Klenman highlights lingering feelings of distance from her children and the foreignness that she still feels as a refugee in Canada. At one point, she refers to herself as a living fossil. But that contrasts with the way she's framed, visually framed, in this genre of video testimony, which is intimate, domestic, humanizing, and loved. Historian Annette Villaviorca has scorned the Shoah Foundation for precisely this kind of framing. Whereas the early interviews from the Fortunoff conveyed what she called, quote, survivor's sense of having lived on another planet, by the time Spielberg started collecting testimonies for the Shoah Foundation in 1994, the goal of video testimony was, quote, to show ordinary people who've returned to normal. Villaviorca sees this as a staged managed distortion. I think, though, particularly given some of the alienated visions of the Holocaust that my book identifies from the 1960s and 70s, which portray not just perpetrators, but Jewish victims too, as others from a terrifying beyond. I think this process of domestication, which you see here in video testimony, iterated thousands of times over on the small screen, this process was crucial. By contrasting the frames of representation that emerged with video testimony and the release of documentaries like Landsman Shoah, by contrasting those frames with an earlier otherworldly paradigm of remembrance, the book shows the enormous amount of transnational and contingent cultural work that's been necessary to constitute Jewish victims of the Holocaust as fully human, grievable lives worthy of mourning beyond survivor communities. The final chapter and conclusion identify actually the resurfacing of some of the paradigms from chapter 2 on Planet Auschwitz and more recent representations of the Holocaust that I argue have been reshaping its memory in the Anthropocene. In the 1960s, the strange convergence of the space race, reemergent Holocaust memory, and decolonization raised questions about what it means to be a human who can be recognized as such and what our relationship is to the planet. Today, rapidly changing environmental conditions on our planet are raising related questions about what kind of human or even post-human life demands recognition, mourning, and justice. I discuss works from the 1990s by authors like W.G. Sebald and Anne Michaels, who revived an earlier surreal aesthetic to incorporate the Holocaust into an expanded conception of geologic time in the face of impending environmental catastrophe. The conclusion explores the very disturbing political implications of analogies being drawn by theorists, historians, journalists, and scientists who, when they use terms such as climate change denialism and bearing witness to extinction events, they're drawing on Holocaust memory as a kind of usable past to think the Anthropocene. Some of those analogies I find legitimate. Indeed, Holocaust denialists and climate change denialists do use similar tactics to promote disinformation. Other analogies, though, I'm far more critical of. So I'm aware now that I probably have at this point gone over time, so I'll stop there. Thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to your questions. And at this point, I will send it over to Shir.
Thank you so much, Kate, for this wonderful presentation. And I also want to thank you for writing such an engaging book that I really enjoyed learning from. I also want to start by thanking everyone at the Mosse Zucker Goldberg New Book Series, especially to Chad and to Sky, for inviting me to participate in this conversation today. This book, as I think we all got the sense, is extremely rich. It weaves together various fascinating threads. And in the brief comment that I prepared for the day, I will only limit myself to highlighting a few of them. And I want to start by focusing on this exciting new timeline that Kate proposes in her book. So as we've heard in the presentation, this book traces the aesthetic language that survivors and various memory agents turn to when they sought to narrate or to depict the catastrophe of the Holocaust. And the book starts with the immediate post-war moment leading all the way up to our present day. With this chronological scope, Kate then uncovers the emergence of norms and practices, as well as the challenges to these norms and practices as they together formed transnational memory culture. The book chapters roughly map out a chronology of genres or questions that Kate identifies as particularly generative at specific moments of the post-war era. And we've heard the overview of the chapters in Kate's presentation. And importantly, she links these discursive and aesthetic stages to major events along the geopolitical timeline and the societal dynamics and anxieties that they produced. The book travels very persuasively in my mind, across this chronological mnemonic discourse. But I also think that one of its strengths is showing that this chronology was far from neat. And there was always some measure of leakage between forms of representation. We see realist grounding and evidentiary narratives existing alongside surrealism in the immediate post-war years. Meanwhile, we also see otherworldly depictions that are seeping through testimonies of survivors that were meant to verify and to authenticate. Throughout the decades after 1945, there are multiple examples in the book of survivors and of memory agents that mix real and surreal, fact and fiction, and insisting on plural representations. And this doesn't mean that the timeline that Kate charts throughout the book and the transformations that she's paying attention to, it doesn't mean that they're not helpful for our understanding of Holocaust memory. Quite the contrary, in my mind. I think that this attention to the messiness of the timeline shows that it was always being challenged, and that it is worthwhile paying attention to how it is being challenged, that these challenges tell us something about Holocaust memory and about the emerging norms in Holocaust memory too. The movement across different moments and different memory sites in this book is therefore not meant to outline very neat departure points, but rather to deliver an important reminder of the heterogeneity, nonlinearity, and fluidity of memory. Charting this very flexible landscape of Holocaust memory allows Kate to bring into the fold of her analysis a variety of cultural artifacts that are not immediately associated with this field, as we've heard in the presentation. Everything from Hollywood alien movies to animal rights manifestos. And in this endeavor of an open reading, I see Kate as working alongside scholars like Darcy Berkeley, who excavated Holocaust memory in Fred Zinnemann's Western High Noon, or someone like Yulia Komska, who reads the story of Curious George alongside the displacement history of his creators, who were refugees from Nazism, but also as a product of exploring humanity's relation to nature. And Kate's book is really a meaningful addition to this project of tracing interpretations of Holocaust memory across genres and across aesthetic languages. This book does not only help us to expand our visual field of where we could read Holocaust memory in play, it also demands that we deepen our existing parameters of our understanding of Holocaust memory by inviting us to revisit seminal memory products like Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, or the Fortunoff Testimony Archive that we've heard of. And Kate offers us a fresh and innovative reading of their work and their impact. We also, through this book, are introduced to lesser known figures in Holocaust memory, artists like Yehuda Bakon or Elza Langer. And Kate also invites us to revisit very canonical figures in Holocaust memory through their lesser known works. So, for example, we read from Paul Celan not only through his celebrated poetry in Kate's book, but also through his commentary on painters Edgage and his catalog. From Hannah Arendt, we read not only from The Banality of Evil book, but also her 1963 essay on space travel. And this extremely rich array of reference points connects to one of the other key threads of the book, which revolves around the question of Holocaust representability. Kate's exploration of this question is not animated by a desire to resolve this dilemma. Rather, the representability debate here serves as an entry point to expose far more foundational questions that were driving artistic and representational engagements with the Holocaust. Questions like, how can we make room for the lost in our world? How can we preserve a sense of kinship and a sense of connection with the dead? And these were the questions that drove multiple experiments with representations and narrations that are explored in this book. Each in their own way, these experiments were searching for ways to sustain the existence of lost worlds and to keep some kind of access point open to them. And Brackney even argues that when the axiom that the Holocaust was an event that defied representation, when that began crystallizing sometime in the late 1980s, this axiom in itself posed one answer to these more elemental questions about our ability to keep a connection to all that was lost in the Holocaust. And in this sense, the book does not argue the merits of the irrepresentability notion. It also doesn't seek to explore how artists negotiated the limits of representation. Rather, Kate historicizes this idea of the irrepresentability of the Holocaust, first by locating it alongside the spread of documentarian practices of memory culture that emerges in the late 1970s, but also by showing throughout the book again and again that representation techniques were always eclectic, were always multivocal and experimental, that they were not always driven by a pursuit for clarity and clarification, and that they often assumed a dialogic function between lost worlds and the people who were committed to mourning these lost worlds. And there is, as we've seen, and as Kate pointed out, there's a certain unease in coming to terms with the deliberate opacity that many of the works that she analyzes present to us. Kate mentioned that she sees that in the classroom. I certainly do as well. To some extent, this certain sense of unease is an outcome of the fact that we've all become accustomed to a certain narration of Holocaust stories that seek substantiation above all. But the artists and the memory agents in this book give us surreal, sometimes fantastical, sometimes impenetrable interpretations. And when it comes to events of mass violence of this nature, like the Holocaust, these interpretations can feel almost abrasive. And this is a tension that Kate addresses throughout the book in various junctures. We are already at the beginning in the first chapter, we see that immediately after the Second World War ended, there was an evidentiary impulse at play that demanded a kind of proof-producing chronicling from survivors. And for me, it was particularly fascinating to see how Kate was documenting this evidentiary impulse and the otherworldly interpretations existing side by side across the stages that she works through. So, for example, the surrealist artists that were working in the 40s and 50s that to some extent rejected the imperative of proof in their artistic work could still be engaging with this imperative in other platforms. And perhaps the most prominent example of that is Yiddish poet Avrum Zucker that we started with, who was the only witness at the Nuremberg trial to give voice to Holocaust victims, and someone who clearly understood the importance of testimony, but who in his writing also insisted on structuring a fantasy like afterlife for the loved ones that he lost, a world that did not conform to the demands of proof making. And there are multiple other examples like that throughout the book. And in people like Zucker, we see the convergence of the figure of the witness with what Brackney terms as the anti-witness. A very crucial point in the book where Brackney addresses this tension is in her analysis of Yechiel Dinur's testimony in the Eichmann trial that we've heard of, where he described Auschwitz as another planet. And in Holocaust memory, this provocation by Dinur still animates debates that reflect this deep tension between documentary remembrance on one hand and interpretative remembrance on the other hand. His sci-fi-like metaphor was sometimes perceived as a threat to the need to substantiate the realness of the event. Even more so, he dared to bring this suggestive interpretation into the courtroom, into the place of truth and of evidence. Even observers who were sympathetic to Dinur and his statement often choose to explain them through the lens of trauma discourse, which Brackney also addresses in the book. And so these defenders of Dinur explain his plea to another planet as an outcome of his tormented consciousness. And Cade asks us to consider that another planet was not only that. And she places Dinur alongside other forms of interpretative, surreal, fantastical representations, and also alongside these contemporary anxieties and hopes about space travel. And in doing so, she asks that we read Dinur's words not as the comment on the unimaginability of Nazi violence, as it was often read, but actually as his way of narrating how the victims continue to exist in his world. The rise of testimonies also that we're seeing in the 1980s was partially an outcome of this dilemma, of this tension between truth and interpretation, needing to balance free form representation with evidence. And it became more urgent at that point in time in the 1980s and late 70s already, in light of the emergence of buttoned-up Holocaust denial, when deniers like David Irving or Robert Faurisson used the veneer of revisionism and scientific discourse to spread their anti-Semitic hatred. And the need to substantiate in response to these denies gave force to the project of witnessing. However, Kate also reminds us here that testimonies like the one that the Fortunoff archive began collecting back then were not always accepted as sources of historical validity. And we are reminded in the book that the Fortunoff archive was initially guided not by impulses of seeking evidentiary material, but actually by psychoanalytic sensibilities and by increasing recognitions of the functions of trauma. Many historians were initially reluctant to work with these testimonies as sources, and it took some time before oral testimonies gained the recognition that they today have as a crucial component in our understanding of the Holocaust as a historical event. But if today these testimonies are acknowledged as a sort of depository of truth, the survivors themselves do not shy away from surreal imagery or from emphasizing the otherworldly nature of their experiences. And we heard in today's presentation in the book, Kate gives even more examples of when survivors convey a sense of feeling disconnected from the real world, feeling like aliens, even questioning that there is something as a shared sense of reality. And considering the place of surreal narration in interviews, Kate then wonders whether the key difference between the otherworldly surreal artworks that the book opens with and these survivor testimonies that we encounter later in the book. Perhaps the real difference between them is not the irrationality of the former and the factuality of the latter. Perhaps the difference lies in the addressee of these memory products. The surrealist artists were seeking to communicate with a lost world, with people no longer around them, and they utilize an impenetrable language to do that. In the testimonies, survivors were asked to establish a dialogue with the living, with people who did not experience the horrors. And therefore, they needed to use a common accepted language to be able to allow listeners to access their experiences. Another really fascinating thread in the book I want to highlight is the place of embodiment that is extremely fascinating as it is woven throughout the chapters. Kate shows how we can trace efforts towards both corporal and spatial embodiment across various, often very different modes of representation. For example, we see in the works of the surrealist artists of the 40s, 50s, a kind of fascination with the victims' bodies. And this fascination, Kate explains to us, was not morbid, but it was rather a form of a communal effort to keep a bond with these victims alive. Because they were robbed of a gravesite to mourn by, these artists turned to surrealism to imagine a spectral existence of their kin. As we've heard with the excerpts from the poem from Zucker, surrealist representations also worked to imagine the lost worlds that they were aspiring to commune with along the geographic spatial coordinates of our natural world. They envision parallel realms where water and air and soil provided shape and provided rhythm for the otherworldly existence of the lost kin. Even in the arrival of absence aesthetics, Kate identifies a similar quest for making the lost present. And the absence aesthetic that is often articulated through silences and through empty spaces is most prominently studied in the book through Claude Lanzmann's Shoah. In the film's critical reception, Lanzmann's repetitive use of blankness and of stillness is frequently linked to this question of representability or irrepresentability. And Kate approaches absence in the film from a different angle, understanding this aesthetic choice as a part of Lanzmann's ritual of seeking intimacy with the event. And she reads the emptiness of Shoah's aesthetic as a refiguration of the Holocaust, an attempt to restore the physicality that was attempted to be destroyed by making it present, by tracing the outlines of its absence. Before I come to an end, I want to share that I found the book not only insightful, but also so inviting through its lyrical reflections. And I want to give just a few examples. So in one instance, when Kate writes of the surreal artists, she describes them as, quote, united in their effort to imagine interim worlds for bodies that were never buried. In another instance, when she's analyzing the works of Czech artist Jindřich Heisler alongside Paul Celan, she notes how both of them, quote, displace the earthly onto the ethereal. And later in the book, in reading Sebald's Rings of Saturn, Kate describes the anecdotes that he combines in the book as, quote, constituting a series of horrific reprises in a tune that the narrator recognizes but cannot quite remember. And I wanted to highlight these quotes, not only to compliment Kate for her prose, which I certainly want to do, but also because I think they show us the care and the attention with which this book was written. And it's a theme that demands care and attention. And I think Kate should really be applauded for achieving that. I want to end by emphasizing that for me personally, at a moment when Holocaust memory is being weaponized and utilized to justify brutal violence against Palestinians, to oppress voices around the world that speak against this violence, and also to fuel an unprecedented attack on our educational institutions. Books like this that remind us that Holocaust memory is not the property of the nation state are more important than ever. And I am very grateful that I was given the opportunity to think closely with it. And I'll end with that.
I want to start at the end here by saying thank you to Kate and to Sheer for that description of the book and for Sheer's thoughtful comments on it. And we have limited time because of my own teaching schedule. So I'm just going to throw a couple of questions in for Kate, and we'll be able to wrap up just after those. So we have one from Shreya Nand here that is in the Q&A that I think is a really great question. Do surreal depictions risk distancing people from the reality of violence, or do they make it easier to understand the unimaginable? And an earlier question that came in, I will read as well. Kate, you could just take any or whichever of these when I finish. If a museum wanted to depart from the international consensus on memory and integrate more successfully some of the initial cultural reactions to the Holocaust, how might you advise them? I mean, I was thinking of this with this question about the ongoing work to refresh the permanent exhibit at USHMM right now. So if you could take those, I thank you both for all that you've given us so far.
Thank you so much. First, I just want to start by saying thank you so much to Sheer for your attention to the book and your extremely lucid commentary. I feel that you summarized the book better than I could myself. I just appreciate that so much. You've given me so much to think about. So regarding the questions, I guess I'll take the last one first on integrating some of this imagery perhaps into a museum setting. There are, so if you flip through the book is filled with images, and I do think often about, well, I am a writer, and this is my form. I do wonder sometimes if this material would almost be better framed in a kind of exhibition format, so that the kind of chronology or overlapping chronologies that Sheer pointed to, you could actually sort of walk through them and experience these sort of changes in memory culture by walking past the images themselves and reflecting on how you experience those images too. I don't think that would ever substitute for comprehensive scholarly histories of the Holocaust and the ways that they're presented in realist formats in a museum. I think you would have to retain that material, but certainly adding a section on sort of cultural responses to this, adding a section on survivor art and survivor literature, and the ways that these memories have been processed, I think could reorient at a space like the USHMM could reorient a visitor's kind of initial expectations about what they were going to see, right? And I would love to have the opportunity to think about what that would look like, and what its relationship would be, right, to the sort of more conventional historical layout of the museum. Regarding the question of, do these surreal depictions distance audiences who did not experience this past themselves from the reality of the Holocaust? I think it sort of, to relate it back to the museum question, and also to Sheer's comment, a poet like Zucker simultaneously had two goals. He gave extraordinarily compelling testimony at the Nuremberg trials. I think he was asked to speak on behalf of something like all of Russian Jewry. He was given like 15 or 20 minutes. And he testified in stark and devastating, straightforward terms about the death of his infant son, the death of his mother, the murder of his son. So he certainly testified to what happened in clear language in a way as a means to hold accountable perpetrators and preserve history. He was committed to that. But in his artwork, Primo Levi once said that, after the Holocaust, survivors emerged with this need to tell their story, and it was a kind of primal need that almost competed with their other elementary needs, like to eat and to sleep, and they needed people to believe them, to tell people what had happened. And I think Sutzkever, in something like Green Aquarium, is working through another totally different but also fundamental need, which he addresses through fantasy, which is, how do you mourn and maintain connection with, this entire world that's lost, without being able to bury it, without having conventional mourning rites to mark these people and these places as important to you? What do you do? And what he does in an extraordinary way is he creates this alternative space of afterlife, which is actually not a distant planet Auschwitz, right? Which is very proximate to Green Aquarium, which he can touch, right? Which he's just peering into. Ceylon, in a kind of related image, talks about an angel with I think it's like a clubbed foot or a bruised foot, who's walking over destroyed Vitebsk. So, I mean, these are figures of afterlife, but they're hybrid forms. They're not totally spiritual. They're not distant. They're very corporal. They still have these kinds of physical bodies. And Ceylon often addresses a you in his poetry, and Sutzkever also seems to address the past in his poetry. Who they're talking to is a complicated question. So, and Ceylon in particular, I think, invents this kind of hermetic language for speaking to this mysterious you, which could be a lover, could be his audience, but could also be those who he's lost, right? And it depends, the goals of someone like Sutzkever, it depends on the audience, right? And I think what they bring up in their early works is this kind of other kind of addressee, this other you, who might be a you who they're mourning for, who they're trying to maintain a connection with. And that mourning itself, I do think, is a kind of like elementary need. So the fact that it doesn't represent the past in the most direct or instructional way speaks to the fact that these texts and these images have different goals, right? They're trying to do something else. That said, while I do admire a text like Green Aquarium deeply, and while a lot of the works particularly identified in chapter 1, I think, are really important, and I would wish to restore to some type of canon, some of the stuff from the 1960s and 70s, some of the Planet Auschwitz sources, I think, are they disturb me. I think they're highly problematic. I think they dehumanize survivors. I do think they sometimes use the Holocaust as a kind of philosophical vehicle rather than directly addressing this past. So yeah, there certainly is that risk. And particularly as Holocaust consciousness began to reemerge in the 60s, some of the sources that were reflecting on that, I would say particularly, but not exclusively, by people who had not survived themselves. Yeah, I think the impact on audiences was questionable. And I think that in some ways justifies all of the polemics. And I didn't get into this in the talk, but in chapter 4, I speak at length about, these very intense sort of theory wars over how to represent the Holocaust, whether or not it's representable. These were vociferous debates. And I think that is in part because they were answering in a different way than Sutzkever? How do you mourn for this population that was never buried? How do we come up with a different way to mark these lives as important? And one way to do that is to come up with rules for how you do address this past, how you do visualize it, and how you don't, right? And those gestures, I don't really comment on whether or not the Holocaust is representable. I do think saying you should do it this way and not another way is an important gesture of respect, which attempts to rehumanize a population that was, horrifically dehumanized, right? And how you do that afterwards is just a major question that all of the different, artists and theorists that I'm looking at in the book, they explore that in different ways.
Well, thank you for those answers. And thank you again, Kate, for your discussion of Surreal Geographies. And thank you to Sheer for your comment. Thank you to everyone who attended today as well, and to our supporters, one of which I didn't read earlier. I wanted to thank the Center for German and European Studies at UW-Madison. And we'll be rushing out of here as I head off to teach my 2 p.m. Eastern class. So thank you all again, and have a great rest of your day.